Hello, everybody. Today I'll be presenting results from my second doctoral project. And before I get started, I'd really just like to thank my co-authors of this presentation. So my research revolves around attentional focus and the findings that motor performance and learning are enhanced when one directs their concentration to the movement's effects, which is an external focus, as opposed to the muscles or body parts associated with doing the movement, known as an internal focus. This finding has been well established in healthy populations, as well as populations requiring rehabilitation from musculoskeletal dysfunctions. Now, before I share the results of my second project, it'll be worthwhile to speak about my first study. Overall, my research interest has been in the translation of the attentional focus motor learning principle into physiotherapy practice. And so I first questioned how physios are providing attentional focus cues in their practice. While this question has been researched through a series of observational studies in the UK and the Netherlands, limited work has been done in Canada. Now, this research typically shows that physiotherapists heavily favor internal cues. However, one study showed differences between how they cue for instruction versus feedback statements, and so we considered this in the design of our study. In my first study, I wanted to confirm that Canadian physios lean to the provision of more internally focused cues, and to do this, we created a questionnaire titled the Therapist Perceptions of Motor Learning Principles Questionnaire, which had components that collected data on the physio's characteristics, their self-reported attentional focus cueing in 6 hypothetical scenarios, and their self-reported awareness of the attentional focus literature. So here's an example of one of those 6 hypothetical scenarios. Physios were presented with each scenario in addition to both an externally and internally focused instruction or feedback cue. Then they were instructed to select the percentage of time that they would provide each cue, with the condition that these percentages should add up to 100%, as shown in this example. So what did we find? Well, the questionnaire was completed by 121 Canadian physiotherapists, and the results were consistent with the previous findings, with physiotherapists only selecting the external cue roughly 30% of the time. And this was consistent across both the feedback and instruction scenarios. An interesting finding, however, was that physiotherapists' provision of attentional focus cues seemed to be highly dependent on the task type. So although 4 of the 6 tasks resulted in a very low provision of external cues, the reaching task and the pelvic squeeze were 2 very clear exceptions. Unfortunately, a big limitation of the questionnaire was that it was not designed to grant physios any opportunity to elaborate on why they selected specific statements. And so, the research presented today consists of the results from 8 Ontario physios who were involved in semi-structured one-on-one interviews with me. These physios were all working in private practice with patients recovering from musculoskeletal dysfunction. Now, the purpose of the interviews were multifold, but my presentation today is specific to the interview questions that allowed us to gain an understanding of what factors influenced physios' responses on those questionnaire scenarios. Specifically, question 1 looked at factors they considered while selecting statements on questionnaire. Question 2 sought to get their perspective on why Canadian physios seemingly use more internal cueing. And question 3 was designed to elaborate on the potential influence of task type on attentional focus cueing. So all participants received a link to the questionnaire roughly 48 hours before their virtual interview. Each participant shared their insight on each question, and when they had no new information to add, 2 prompts were provided by me in order to enrich the discussion. The interviews were all video recorded and transcribed to aid in their coding and interpretation through a qualitative content analysis. The coding scheme was developed through both deductive and inductive approaches, and all of the transcripts were coded independently by 2 researchers who then met to discuss the codes in order to achieve a consensus. So I won't go too deep into this slide. However, the purpose of this table is just to highlight that the questionnaire data collected from this group of 8 leads us to believe that it was a good representative sample from which to gain more insight into the factors that influence responses on that questionnaire in study 1. In terms of the results, the research led us to organize them into 4 categories: physio, client, and task characteristics, as well as cueing strategies. Importantly, we differentiate between codes for concepts that physios self-generated versus ones that they elaborated upon once prompted with the idea, and only codes that were self-generated by 3 or more physios will be presented today. Within physiotherapist characteristics, physios reported that they tended to provide more internally focused cues as a result of their education. More specifically, their clinical practice often only utilized internal cueing, and a constant focus on anatomy naturally led to the development of an internal cueing style that they carried into their practice. As well, physios spoke about their previous experiences in sport, where they learned to cue from their respected coaches who mostly provided them with internal cues. Finally, physios spoke to how their own experiences in the field caused them to provide more internal cues, with one physio specifically mentioning that they felt they saw better outcomes when they cued their client internally. Moving on to client characteristics, we saw much consensus on the fact that physios specifically provided internal cues to clients with a strong kinesthetic awareness, especially if they had developed it through athletic experiences. On a similar note, physios mentioned that they only favored the use of external cues when they felt that their client wasn't quite in touch with their body. Half of the physios went further to categorize their clients as internal or external learners and reported cueing in accordance with their learning type. Finally, discussions around the client's rehab population revealed that physios favored external focused cueing for neurological rehab clients and older adults, seemingly due to their perceptions of their clients' cognitive limitations. Within task characteristics, a major point of discussion surrounded the manipulation of an object during a task and its functionality within that task. Physios agreed that they were more likely to use an external focus cue if the task required the client to manipulate an object, and even more likely if this object served a functional role in the task. Physios also reported that if the goal of the task was functional, as opposed to simply a strengthening exercise, they were more likely to cue their client to the desired outcome of the task using an external cue. A novel topic that emerged was the idea that the body region in which the task took place could impact how physios are cueing their clients. More specifically, they discussed how they tend to use external cues when the body region contains muscles that the clients aren't quite familiar with consciously and independently activating, like their core, or regions that are more sensitive to put a spotlight on, such as the pelvic floor. The final category was cueing strategies. All of the physios reported a preference for internal focus cueing, but stated that they adapt to their clients such that they continue cueing internally, that leads to successful outcomes, and switch to external cueing if the client isn't achieving the desired movement. Finally, physios also reported that the overall goal of their instructions and feedback was not actually to achieve a specific attentional focus, but instead to use the most efficient cue to get the outcome that they're looking for. These results overall show that there are a fair number of factors influencing physios' attentional focus cueing. Getting a better understanding of these factors begins to initiate a two-way communication between motor learning researchers and physios to promote both evidence-based practice and research that takes into account real-world considerations. With this in mind, the next steps of my research are to analyze the barriers physios face when trying to adopt an external focused cueing style, and then to address these barriers through the development and delivery of an educational workshop. So thank you all very much for listening to me present, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now.